Section 1 of A Daughter of the Sioux. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mary Rohde. A Daughter of the Sioux by General Charles King. Chapter 1. Foreshadowed Events. The major commanding looked up from the morning report and surveyed the post adjutant with something of perturbation, if not annoyance, in his grim gray eyes. For the fourth time that week had Lieutenant Field requested permission to be absent for several hours. The major knew just why the junior wished to go and where. The major knew just why he wished him not to go, but saw fit to name almost any other than the real reason, when with a certain awkward hesitancy he began: "Well, is the post return ready?" "It will be, sir, in abundant time," was the prompt reply. "You know they sent it back for correction last month," hazarded the commander. "And you know, sir, the error was not mine," was the instant rejoinder, so quick, sharp, and positive as to carry it at a bound to the verge of disrespect, and the keen blue eyes of the young soldier gazed, frank and fearless, into the heavily ambushed grays of the veteran in the chair. It made the latter wince and stir uneasily. "If there's one thing I hate, Field, it is to have my paper sent back by some whipsnapper of a clerk, inviting attention to this or that error, and I expect my adjutant to see to it that they don't." "Your adjutant does see to it, sir. I'm willing to bet a month's pay fewer errors have been found in the papers of Fort Frayne than any post in the Department of the Platte. General Williams told you as much when you were in Omaha." The major fairly wriggled in his cane-bottomed whirligig. What young Field said was true, and the major knew it. He knew, moreover, there wasn't a more painstaking post adjutant from the Missouri to the mountains. He knew their monthly reports, returns as the regulations call them, were referred to by a model adjutant general as model papers. He knew it was due to young Field's care and attention, and he knew he thought all the world of that young gentleman. It was just because he thought so much of him he was beginning to feel that it was high time to put a stop to something that was going on. But it was a delicate matter, a woman was the matter, and he hadn't the moral courage to go at it the straightforward way. He whipsawed again. Thrumming on the desk with his lean, bony fingers, he began: "If I let my adjutant out so much, what's to prevent other youngsters asking similar indulgence?" The answer came like the crack of a whip. "Nothing, sir, and far better would it be for everybody concerned if they spent more hours in the saddle and fewer at the store." This was too much for the one listener in the room. With something like the sound of a suppressed sneeze, a tall, long-legged captain of cavalry started up from his chair, an outspread newspaper still full stretched between him and the desk of the commander, and, thus hidden as to his face, sidled sniggering off to the nearest window. Young Field had fearlessly, if not almost impudently, hit the nail on the head, and metaphorically rapped the thrumming fingers of his superior officer. Some commanders would have raged and sent the daring youngster right about in arrest. Major Webb knew just what Field referred to, knew that the fascinations of pool, pitch, and poker held just about half his commissioned force at all off-duty hours of the day or night, hanging about the officers' club room at the post trader's. Knew, moreover, that while the adjutant never wasted a moment over cards or billiards, he, the post commander, had many times taken a hand or a cue and wagered his dollars against those of his devoted associates. They all loved him. There wasn't a mean streak in his whole system, said every soldier at Fort Frayne. He had a capital record as a volunteer, a colonel, and later brigade commander in the Great War. He had the brevet of Brigadier General of Volunteers, but he repudiated any title beyond that of his actual rank in the regulars. He was that rara avis, a bachelor field officer, and a bird to be brought down if feminine witchery could do it. He was truthful, generous, high-minded, brave, a man who preferred to be of and with his subordinates rather than above them, to rule through affection and regard rather than the stern standard of command. He was gentle and courteous alike to officers and the rank and file. Though he feared no man on the face of the globe, he was awkward, bungling, and overwhelmingly, lavishly kind and thoughtful in his dealings with the womenfolk of the garrison, for he stood in awe of the entire sisterhood. He could ride like a centaur, he couldn't dance worth a cent. He could snuff a candle with his Colt at 20 paces, and couldn't hit a croquet ball to save his soul. His deep-set gray eyes, under their tangled thatch of brown, gazed straight into the face of every man on the Platte, soldier, cowboy, Indian, or half-breed, but fell abashed if a laundress looked at him. Billy Ray, captain of the sorrel troop and the best light rider in Wyoming, was the only man he ever allowed to straddle a beautiful thoroughbred mare he had bought in Kentucky, but, bad hands or good, there wasn't a riding woman at Frayne who hadn't backed Lorna time and again, because to a woman the major simply couldn't say no. And though his favorite comrades at the post were captains like Blake and Billy Ray, married men both whose wives he worshipped, the major's rugged heart went out especially to Beverly Field, his boy adjutant, a lad who came to them from West Point only 3 years before the autumn this story opens, a young fellow full of high health, pluck, and principle, a tip-top soldier, said everybody from the start, until, as Gregg and other growlers began to declaim, the major completely spoiled him. Here 3 years only out of military leading strings, he was a young cock of the walk, too damn independent for a second lieutenant, said the officers' club element of the command, men like Gregg, Wilkins, Crane, and a few of their following. The keenest young trooper in the regiment, said Blake and Ray, who were among its keenest captains, and never a cloud had sailed across the serene sky of their friendship and esteem until this glorious September of 1880, when Nanette Flower, a brilliant, beautiful brunette, came a visitor to old Fort Frayne. And it was on her account that Major Wood, could he have seen the way, said no to the adjutant's request to be absent again. On her account and that of one other, for that request meant another long morning in saddle with Miss Flower, another long morning in which the sweetest girl in the garrison, so said they all, would go about her daily duties with an aching heart. There was no woman at Fort Frayne who did not know that Esther Dade thought all the world of Beverly Field. There was only one man who apparently had no inkling of it, Beverly Field himself. She was the only daughter of a veteran officer, a captain of infantry, who at the age of 50, after having held a high command in the volunteers during the Civil War, was still meekly doing duty as a company officer of regulars nearly 2 decades after. She had been carefully reared by a most loving and thoughtful mother, even in the crude old days of the army, when its fighting force was scattered in small detachments all over the wide frontier, and men and women, too, lived on soldier rations eked out with game, and dwelt in tents or ramshackle one-storied huts built by the labor of troops. At 12 she had been placed at school in the Far East, while her father enjoyed a 2 years' tour on recruiting service, and there, under the care of a noble woman who taught her girls to be women indeed, not vapid votaries of pleasure and fashion, Esther spent 5 useful years, coming back to her fond father's soldier roof a winsome picture of girlish health and grace and comeliness. A girl who could ride, walk, and run if need be, who could bake and cook, mend and sew, cut, fashion, and make her own simple wardrobe, who knew algebra, geometry, and trig quite as well as, and history, geography, and grammar far better than, most of the young West Pointers. A girl who spoke her own tongue with accuracy and was not badly versed in French. A girl who performed fairly well on the piano and guitar, but who sang full-throated, rejoiceful, exulting, like the lark, the soulful music that brought delight to her aging father, half crippled by the wounds of the war days, and to the mother who so devotedly loved and carefully planned for her. Within a month from her graduation at Madame Piatt's, she had become the darling of Fort Frayne, the pet of many a household, the treasure of her own. With other young gallants of the garrison, Beverly Field had been prompt to call, prompt to be her escort when dance or drive, ride or picnic was planned in her honor, especially the ride, for Mr. Adjutant Field loved the saddle, the open prairie, or the bold, undulating bluffs. But Field was the busiest man at the post. Other youngsters, troop or company subalterns, had far more time at their disposal, and begged for rides and dances, strolls, and sports which the post adjutant was generally far too busy to claim. It was Esther who brought lawn tennis to Frayne, and found eager pupils of both sexes, but Field had been the first to meet and welcome her; had been for a brief time at the start her most constant cavalier. Then, as others began to feel the charm of her frank, cordial, joyous manner, and learned to read the beauty that beamed in her clear, truthful eyes and winsome yet not beautiful face, they became assiduous in turn, two of them almost distressingly so, and she could not wound them by refusals. Then came a fortnight in which her father sat as a member of a court martial down at old Fort Laramie, where were the band, headquarters, and 4 troops of the th, and Captain and Mrs. Freeman, who were there stationed, begged that Mrs. Dade and Esther should come and visit them during the session of the court. There would be all manner of army gaieties and a crowd of outside officers, and, as luck would have it, Mr. Field was ordered thither as a witness in 2 important cases. The captain and his good wife went by stage. Esther and Beverly rode every inch of the way in saddle, camping overnight with their joyous little party at La Bonte. Then came a lovely week at Laramie, during which Mr. Field had little to do but devote himself to, and dance with, Esther. And when his final testimony was given, and he returned to his station, and not until then, Esther Dade discovered that life had little interest or joy without him. But Field rode back unknowing, and met at Frayne, before Esther Dade's return, a girl who had come almost unheralded, making the journey over the Medicine Bow from Rock Springs on the Union Pacific in the comfortable carriage of old Bill Hay, the post trader, escorted by that redoubtable woman, Mrs. Bill Hay, and within the week of her arrival Nanette Flower was the toast of the bachelors' mess, the talk of every household at Fort Frayne. And well she might be. Dark and lustrous were her eyes, black, luxuriant, and lustrous was her hair, dark, rich, and lustrous her radiant beauty. In contour her face was well nigh faultless. It might have been called beautiful indeed but for the lips, or something about the mouth, that in repose had not a soft or winsome line, but then it was never apparently in repose. Smiles, sunshine, animation, rippling laughter, flashing even white teeth, These were what one noted when in talk with Miss Flower. There was something actually radiant, almost dazzling, about her face. Her figure, though petite, was exquisite, and women marked with keen appreciation, if not envy, the style and finish of her varied and various gowns. 6 trunks, said Billy Hay's boss teamster, had been trundled over the range from Rawlins, not to mention a box containing her little ladyship's beautiful English side saddle, Melton bridle, and other equine impedimenta. Did Miss Flower like to ride? She adored it, and Billy Hay had a bay half thoroughbred that could discount the major's mare cross country. All Frayne was out to see her start for her first ride with Beverly Field, and all Frayne reluctantly agreed that sweet Essie Dade could never sit a horse over a ditch or hurdle with the superb grace and unconcern displayed by the daring, dashing girl who had so suddenly become the center of garrison interest. For the first time in her life, Mrs. Bill Hay knew what it was to hold the undivided attention of Army society, for every woman at Fort Frayne was wild to know all about the beautiful newcomer, and only one could tell. Hay, the trader, had prospered in his long years on the frontier, first as a trader among the Sioux, later as sutler, and finally, when Congress abolished that title, substituting therefor the euphemism, without material clog upon the prerequisites, as post trader at Fort Frayne. No one knew how much he was worth, for while apparently a most open-hearted, whole-souled fellow, Hay was reticence itself when his fortunes or his family were matters of question or comment. He had long been married, and Mrs. Hay, when at the post, was a social sphinx, kind-hearted, charitable, lavish to the soldiers' wives and children, and devotion itself to the families of the officers when sickness and trouble came, as come in the old days they too often did. It was she who took poor Ned Robinson's young widow and infant all the way to Cheyenne when the Sioux butchered the luckless little hunting party down by Laramie Peak. It was she who nursed Captain Forrest's wife and daughter through 10 weeks of typhoid, and with her own means sent them to the seashore, while the husband and father was far up on the Yellowstone, cut off from all communication in the big campaign of '76. It was she who built the little chapel and decked and dressed it for Easter and Christmas, despite the fact that she herself had been baptized in the Roman Catholic faith. It was she who went at once to every woman in the garrison whose husband was ordered out on scout or campaign, proffering aid and comfort, despite the fact long whispered in the garrisons of the Platte country that in the old, old days she had far more friends among the red men than the white. That could well be, because in those days white men were few and far between. Everyone had heard the story that it was through her the news of the massacre at Fort Phil Kearny was made known to the post commander, for she could speak the dialects of both the Arapahoe and the Sioux, and had the sign language of the plains veritably at her fingers' ends. There were not lacking those who declared that Indian blood ran in her veins, that her mother was an Ogallala squaw and her father a French Canadian fur trapper, a story to which her raven black hair and brows, her deep dark eyes and somewhat swarthy complexion gave no little color. But long years before, Bill Hay had taken her East, where he had relatives, and where she studied under excellent masters, returning to him summer after summer with more and more of refinement in manner, and so much of style and fashion in dress, that her annual advent had come to be looked upon as quite the event of the season, even by women of the social position of Mrs. Ray and Mrs. Blake, the recognized leaders among the young matrons of the Cavalry, and by gentle Mrs. Dade, to whom everyone looked up in respect, almost in reverence. Despite the mystery about her antecedents, there was every reason why Mrs. Hay should be held in esteem and affection. Bill Hay himself was a diamond in the rough, square, sturdy, uncompromising, generous, and hospitable. His great pride and glory was his wife, his one great sorrow that their only child had died almost in infancy. His solecisms in syntax and society were many. He was given at times to profanity, and at others, when Madam was away, to draw poker. But officers and men alike proclaimed him a man of mettle, and never hesitated to go to him when in financial straits, sure of usurious aid. But even had this not been the case, the popularity of his better half would have carried him through, for there was hardly a woman at Frayne to speak of her except in terms of genuine respect. Mrs. Hay was truth telling, sympathetic, a peacemaker, a resolute opponent of gossip and scandal of every kind, a woman who minded her own business and was only mildly insistent that others should do likewise. She declined all overtures leading to confidences as to her past, and demanded recognition only upon the standard of the present, which was unimpeachable. All the same, it came something like a shock to society at Frayne that when she appeared at the post this beautiful autumn of 1880, nearly 3 months later than the usual time, she should be accompanied by this brilliant and beautiful girl of whom no one of their number had previously heard, and whom she smilingly, confidently presented as "my niece, Miss Flower." There was a dance the night the Dades got home from Laramie. Nearly all day long had they driven in the open buckboard over the rough, winding road along the Platte, and Mrs. Dade was far too tired to think of going, but Esther was so eager that her father put aside his precious paper, tucked her under his arm, and trudged cheerily away across the parade toward the bright lights of the Hop Room. They had a fairly good string orchestra at Frayne that year, and one of Strauss's most witching waltzes, Sounds from the Vienna Woods, had just been begun as father and daughter entered. A dozen people, men and women both, saw them and noted what followed. With bright, almost dilated eyes and a sweet, warm color mantling her smiling face, Esther stood gazing about the room, nodding blithely as she caught the glance of many a friend, yet obviously searching for still another. Then of a sudden they saw the bonny face light up with joy uncontrollable, for Mr. Field came bounding in at the side door, opening from the veranda of the adjutant's office. He saw her, smiled joyous greeting as he came swiftly toward her, then stopped short as a girl in black grenadine dropped the arm of her cavalier, the officer with whom she was promenading, and without a moment's hesitation placed her left hand, fan bearing, close to the shoulder knot on his stalwart right arm, her black gloved right in his white kidded left, and instantly they were gliding away together, he nodding half in whimsical apology, half in merriment over the black spangled shoulder, and the roseate light died slowly from the sweet, smiling face. The smile itself seemed slowly freezing, as the still dilated eyes followed the graceful movements of the couple, slowly, harmoniously winding and reversing about the waxen floor. Even at the Point she had never seen more beautiful dancing. Even when her stanchest friend, Mrs. Blake, pounced upon her with fond, anxious, welcoming words, and Mrs. Ray, seeing it all, broke from her partner's encircling arm and sped to add her greeting, the child could hardly regain self-control, and one loving-hearted woman cried herself to sleep that night for the woe that had come into the soft and tender eyes, which had first beamed with joy at sight of Beverly Field, then filled with sudden dread immeasurable. but the major sought to block that morning ride in vain. The impetuous will of the young soldier prevailed, as he might have known it would, and from the rear gallery of his quarters, with his strong field glass, Major Webb watched the pair fording the Platte far up beyond Pyramid Butte. "Going over to that damn Sioux village again," he swore between his set teeth. "That makes the third time she's headed him there this week." And with strange annoyance at heart he turned away to seek comfort in council with his stanch henchman, Captain Ray, when the orderly came bounding up the steps with a telegraphic despatch which the major opened, read, turned a shade grayer, and whistled low. "My compliments to Captains Blake and Ray," said he to the silent young soldier, standing attention at the doorstep, "and say I should be glad to see them here at once." That night the sentries had just called off 1:30 when there was some commotion at the guard house. A courier had ridden in post haste from the outlying station of Fort Beecher, far up under the lee of the Big Horn range. The corporal of the guard took charge of his reeking horse, while the sergeant led the messenger to the commander's quarters. The major was already awake and half dressed. "Call the adjutant," was all he said, on reading the despatch, and the sergeant sped away. In less than 5 minutes he was back. "I could get no answer to my knock or ring, sir, so I searched the house. The adjutant isn't there." Chapter 2